At the time when I was at the lowest point of my life, something unimaginable had happened to me that I still don't know how to explain it. It was quite inconceivable that it would have been easy to think that I'm just making things up, but it becomes undeniable when I was not the only one who experienced this paranormal phenomenon. During that time, dozens of people were replaced by entities who lingered and waited for a perfect moment to attack. Our lives were taken from us, and most of us were unable to take it back. A few weeks after my wife had left me, the factory I was working for suddenly decided to drop a number of employees. Because of what happened with many companies during the pandemic, they made sure that they wouldn't be shorthanded with employees again by replacing some of the manned roles with machines. While the cost of living was getting significantly higher, I got fired. I was devastated to say the least, and this happened while I was already failing to cope with the relationship that I lost. Just when I thought that my day couldn't get any worse, I then saw the local news about the strange series of incidents that were happening all over the town. Witnesses claimed that they saw their doppelgangers, and all the sightings were reported within the day. This inexplicable occurrence was covered by the local news when the authorities had received dozens of calls that stated the same thing. Bizarre-looking strangers that eerily resembled their faces had suddenly appeared when nobody else was around, and they tried to boldly approach them until they ran away or screamed for help. All the reports described these doppelgangers as ghostly beings with unnaturally pale skin, deep dark eyes, and moved impossibly fast with jittery movements. They said that you will feel the presence of someone staring at you from afar, and then you will see them if you look close enough. Once the doppelganger realizes that you saw them, it will appear right before you in a flash. Some of the witnesses claim that these ghostly entities were trying to look at them straight in the eyes before they were able to get away from them. It would have been nothing but a hoax if not for the footage that one of the witnesses was able to record when her doppelganger appeared in her backyard. The footage was blurry since it was taken from her room on the second floor. She said that she felt something strange when her attention was drawn towards a specific tree in her own backyard. Thinking that it might be a thief, she started to record and zoomed into the exact spot where her intuition was telling her to look. However, she realized that her assumption was wrong when a white-faced lady suddenly peeked from behind the tree. She said that this horrifying stranger was looking straight at her, but then it vanished when her son entered the room. Despite of its paranormal nature, this odd incident warranted attention due to the number of reports and the footage. They issued a warning to the citizens by televising it in the local news. If you see someone that looks identical to you, run away and hide. That was the repeating message the TV broadcasted. They advised the people to stay with their families or remain in groups, and if anyone sees a bizarre-looking stranger, avoid making eye contact and immediately call for help. I was quite dumbfounded by what I just saw. It was only natural that I didn't believe it at first, but then I also experienced the same feeling that they were describing while I was in front of the TV. I was all alone in my apartment, and all my windows were closed. But then, I felt a cold breeze brushing against my skin. I felt goosebumps all over my body when I suddenly felt that I was being watched. Just like they had described, my attention was drawn to a particular spot for some reason. The door of my cabinet was slightly opened, and I kept on staring at that gap for a while. I was trying to tell myself that I was just influenced by the news and started to imagine things, but I still couldn't look away. I shone a light on the opening using my phone in order to convince myself that there was nothing there. But then, my heart almost broke out of my chest when I realized that I was wrong. When I moved my light across the cabinet door, I saw someone peeking through the gap. My knees buckled, and I dropped my phone as I fell on the floor. The cabinet slowly slid open, and a man with an ash-white skin stepped out. He was twitching unnaturally, as if every move he made was making him glitch. His eyes were wide open as he stared down at me. He had a very gloomy expression on his face which looked exactly like mine. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I was too terrified to get back up. The only thing I could do was cover my eyes and scream. Unfortunately, my apartment unit was the only one occupied within that floor. Nobody could hear my scream, and nobody came to help. I blindly searched for my phone while moving my hand across the floor while the other was covering my eyes, but I must have thrown it several feet away since I couldn't find it anywhere near me. I had no choice but to open my eyes and look for it as fast as I could. My doppelganger was standing right in front of me a second ago, and so I assumed that he was still in front of me at the time. In order to avoid his glare, I turned my head and set my sight low. I did not hear a single sound coming from him, but at the moment when I opened my eyes, his face was already right in front of me. He bent his body quite unnaturally in order to position himself in a way that he could stare at my face within a few inches away. Unfortunately, our eyes met, and I passed out before I could even react. The last scene I remember was my soul being pushed out of my body. The next thing I knew, I was transported into a place where everything was gray. As I walked around, I was very lightheaded and unstable, as if I just woke up from a coma. The air was heavy, and the sky was dark. It looked like a very different world, and yet it felt strangely similar. As I walked further, I finally came across another person who also seemed lost. He was a middle-aged man named John, and he also encountered his doppelganger before he was transported to this dreary space. Just like me, John was at the lowest point of his life. He shared his story as we walked together, and I learned that his wife had passed just a few months ago. He was left with his teenage son who despised him for not being around most of the time, and he was visited by his doppelganger while he was reading the letter of his son who ran away. John suddenly stopped walking, and he pointed at a house that appeared more like an afterimage than an actual physical structure. While I was looking at it, I was surprised when he told me that it was his home. A few moments later, I saw some hazy figures of people passing across the street. For some reason, we instinctively hid ourselves behind the trees. It was then when I realized where we were. This hazy world that looked more like a mirage to this gray and dreary realm was the world that we knew. A few moments later, a van stopped in front of the house, and a young man stepped out of the vehicle along with the driver who looked exactly like John. His image still looked a bit hazy to me, but John said that he could see him just as clear as he could see me. Ironically, it seemed that the imposter was going along with his son much better than he ever did. John was trying to contain himself as he stared at them from afar. A few moments later, John and I had decided to walk away from his home, but he said that he would return on his own when the imposter was left alone. I was a bit troubled by what he said, but I decided not to say anything at the time. In my mind, the John that was walking along with me was starting to sound like a doppelganger. After strolling for a couple of hours, we discovered some kind of broken image that was deviating from the land. It looked like a shattered window floating in midair, but instead of glass, it looked like a shattered portion of the actual space. We were only wandering aimlessly all this time, but for some reason, John and I felt like we were subconsciously led to it. As we stared at it, more and more people started showing up. Everything that was happening was incredibly overwhelming, but I was trying to understand what was happening right before me as much as I possibly could. Little by little, things began to finally add up. When we encountered our doppelgangers, we were transported to this place that seemed to coexist with the world that we knew. Unaware of each other's existence, a glitch in this realm had enabled the doppelgangers to easily cross over to the living world. Collectively, the people who gathered here were full of regrets, failures, and sadness. The real inhabitants of this dreadful place had used this opportunity to take over our lives while our spirits were low. Our souls were pushed out of our bodies, and our existence were swapped from one another. As the lost spirits were talking to each other and sharing their experiences, the crack on the space was starting to disappear. This realm was healing itself, and the glitch within this space and ours would soon be gone. We realized what we had to do, and we had to act fast in order to get out of this gray world before it was too late. With that in mind, I decided to find my apartment and stalk the doppelganger who put me there. At that point, the souls who were forced to be here had become the doppelgangers. Strangely enough, I was able to navigate myself in the gray realm much easier, as if I've been there before. I could finally notice the people of the living world. However, they looked nothing more but obscure light forms moving slowly. I then realized how the doppelgangers were able to suddenly appear from one place to another in the blink of an eye. It wasn't because they were incredibly fast. The time in this realm was simply moving significantly faster when compared to the living realm. Before I knew it, I was already in front of my apartment. For some reason, I innately avoided being seen by other people. I carefully snuck in during the night, and I waited for the right moment. Just like what John had mentioned, I could see my body much clearer than the other people. It seemed that we were meant to meet our other selves at some point in our lives. I hid under the window curtain as I saw myself going to bed, and when I was about to approach him, he suddenly sprung back up and stared at me. I knew for sure that he didn't see me coming. Just like how I felt before, it was probably the strong intention to attack that alerts the person about the other's presence. Since he already knew where I was hiding, I decided to reveal myself. He began to scream at the top of his lungs, which completely threw me off. I was totally confused why a doppelganger who stole my body would be afraid when the real owner shows up. But then, I saw my reflection on the window. My face was very pale, and my eyes were set deep and dark. Because of the huge difference in time, every slow movement I was making would appear like a rapid jitter to him. Our roles were swapped. At that moment, I was the doppelganger, and he was the human who was terrified from my presence. Before he could run away, I grabbed his head and forcibly opened his eyelids so our eyes would meet. Few moments later, I suddenly blacked out. When I finally regained consciousness, I saw myself lying on my bed in my apartment. Fortunately, I was able to get my body back. However, many unanswered questions still remained. It seemed that the spirit who took over my body completely believed that he was me. While I was traveling in the gray realm, it was starting to look familiar, as if I was gradually recalling a distant memory. In some ways, there was a small possibility that I was actually the person who stole this body. In some ways, it felt as if I was the actual doppelganger.